Today's hobby video on the channel, we're going to be looking at flags, specifically how I go about using flags and applying them to flagpoles and some of the different techniques I use and a couple of the products. I've had a few questions about this in the past, particularly how I get the folded effect on some of my flags. So let's dive straight in and have a look at how I go about it. So the first thing I'll say is I'm going to be using these very nice GMB Designs flags. I have just got these in for the American War of Independence project that I'm working on. And as you can see, one is 23rd foot and the other is just a couple of Betsy Rosses. So that's those. Very nice flags they are too. You may have other preferences, but I find these excellent to work with in 28mm and I've used them on a number of my projects. The figures in this case are not finished. Normally what I would do is finish the figures and then apply the flags. But for purposes of video, I'm going to do it the other way around. So the first things first, these are Perry Miniatures 28mm figures. There are some Royal Welsh Fusiliers on the left, and some Continentals, on the right, sorry, and some Continentals on the left. Now, Perry Miniatures supplies its command packs usually with these soft metal flagpoles, and as you can see, they flex pretty easily. And one of the problems with that might be that you would bend and possibly break them quite easily. So, for example, if I were to accidentally lean on it, it bends straight away. There's only so many times you can bend that back into shape before the metal's going to fatigue and give way. So what I do instead is replace that with these. So these are, I think these are 100mm steel rods, essentially, with sharpened points. I get them from, I think, North Star Figures. The most recent pack has got this sort of diamond head spear tip to it. There is some slight variation between the packs. So I'll use these, cut to size, to replace. What I will say is they are quite sharp. As anybody that's replaced, I don't know, their ancient pike blocks with these kind of things, they can actually be a little bit of a hazard. So just be careful if you're going to use these, both in the process of mounting the flag and when you get them on the tabletop. So that's what I'll be using, apart from which I will go out and we'll get these flags out, cut them to size, and then we'll make a start. And so here's one of the flags cut out. I suggest you use a very sharp pair of scissors to carefully cut this out, or a craft knife, depending on your preference. And either way, just be careful as you go around not to lose any of the nice detail on it. What I will say is you can probably see there are little lines in the corners of the flags. They're not necessarily a good guide for cutting them out, because as you can maybe see there, they don't level with the edges of the flag. I suspect they're probably the artist's guide from when they were originally painted and created by GMB. So just carefully cut around the edges. I mean, you could go quite far with this and tatter the ends of the flags and so on. I'm not going to do any of that. I'll leave that to your personal discretion. So here we've got one of the Betsy Ross flags cut out. The first thing we're going to do is, in order to help us in a moment, just carefully match up the ends and then just very gently start to bend that in. Don't press it flat to a point is what I would say at any stage, because what you might want to do as well is perhaps use the flagpole as a way of bending it into position so that it doesn't fall to a harsh straight line, because that's not what you want, and it won't actually sit up against the flagpole particularly well if we do that. So we can sort of see the size of it. We're just going to align it on the flagpole to sort of roughly see where it sits. And then what you want to try and do is take the figure. In this case, this is your Continental figure. I have not cleaned these up in advance, and I make no apologies for that. And then what we want to do is decide what the length of flagpole is. I mean, you might want to, for example, work out from the historical literature or paintings or photographs actually how tall you want this to be, depending on your preference. But I try and set it to a reasonable sort of human size as to where it might sit. And we're looking at where it's going to sit in the hand, and then as it's probably going to be touching the ground, how long we need it to be and where we're going to cut it to. So, for example, if I were to say that the flagpole is going to sit about there, there's enough room for the flag then to be worked on later. And as you can see, that is how far I want it to go before we get down to the ground. And then what you're going to need to do that is some way of snipping it. So I'm going to use these pliers. And so we're just going to go ahead and cut that to size. There we go. And there, now we've got a nicely sized flagpole. Now, if I were doing this for real, it would be slightly different because the miniature would be finished and on a base. But there we go. So we'll get rid of the excess offcut. And now we've got the right sized flagpole for the figure. There we go. So now what I want to do is move on to getting the flag onto that flagpole, for which you're going to need some trusty PVA glue, any brand you like. This one happens to be from Hobbycraft. And a little bit of water and a brush of some kind to apply it, like this. So having cut the flagpole to size, now we want to go ahead and get that flag onto the flagpole. So, like I said, you're going to need a little bit of PVA glue. And now the next step is completable, if that's a word, in any fashion you like. So basically, I find that it helps just to make the inside of this surface of the flag a little bit damp, and you can achieve that in a variety of ways. You could put a little bit of water on this, get most of it off, and then just apply that so there's a little bit of moisture on the inside. You don't want to soak this because it might ruin the flag. And the other thing I'll say when working with these is because they're so nice and relatively expensive for what they are, although I'm not knocking it on that basis, just make sure your hands are clean so you're not tacking anything off onto them when you work with them. So just damp this down, do not soak it. You could also achieve that by watering down the PVA a little bit. That would achieve, I think, the same effect. Or if you wanted to go a little bit more potentially unhygienic, you can also use a little bit of saliva and just lick the inside of it. But water is fine. So what we'll do is we'll damp the inside of this, and then we will then apply some PVA glue. So there's a little bit of water. I'm just going to get most of it off, and then just apply that to the inside surface, just to make it a little bit more malleable and easy to work with. Okay, so there you go. You can't really see anything in this light, but I assure you there is some moisture on the inside of there. So next, we're just going to get a little bit of PVA glue. Do not overdo it on the PVA glue. A very thin layer will suffice, because when you fold the flag together, it's inevitably going to squeeze out of the sides. And the more PVA glue you put in, the more of that you're going to get. It's going to get on your fingers, and again, it could contribute to damaging the flag, and you might have to start all over, which is not what we want to do. Although in this case, if that does happen, I do have 2 of them. So we're just going to get a little bit of PVA glue. Here we go. So a little bit of PVA glue, and just make sure there's some in the little spine of the flag where it's going to sit against the flagpole. This is maybe the one application of glue I'd say where I wouldn't water it down, because you want to make sure it sits on that flagpole nice and firmly. And then we're just going to carefully just streak a bit of PVA glue across the flag like so. Okay, so here's the flag with a little light layer of PVA glue applied. I've only applied it to one side. You could do it on both, but again, just be careful about the quantity of glue that you're placing inside the flag. So now I want to take the flagpole, place it in there, seat it nicely, and then just be really careful, working from the flagpole end first, not from the outer edge of the flag. The first thing we want to do is make sure that it's sat round the pole nice and tightly, so there's no gap on the outside edge here as far as possible, and then make sure that as it comes together on the other side of the flagpole, that it's nice and tightly nipped together. And we can come back to this at a later stage, but in the first instance, that's relatively well pressed together. And then just carefully work along the entire length of the flag. Now, because hopefully it's damp on the inside, if it doesn't quite meet perfectly, you can very gently, as I'm doing now, slide the 2 surfaces, but it will start to dry relatively quickly. So if you need to make any adjustments, just make sure you do. And check it for both sides. Chances are, like you can see at the end, there might be a little bit of overlap on one or more of the edges. But that is fine, because we can trim that off afterwards. We just try and get it as close as possible and as matched on both sides as possible. So having met the sides together like that, we'll now just go back here and just apply a bit of pressure on the very inside edge of the flag where it meets the flagpole, like I say, to make that squeezed out. You can see there's a little bit of PVA coming out off on my fingers because there's a little bit more in there. So make sure you get rid of that. And that's the flag in the first instance, stuck in like that. And that's pretty straightforward. So you could stop there if you like, but what we're going to do next is go ahead and fold it, because that's one of the things I like to do to give it a bit of dynamism. Now GMB have, because their artwork is very good, already put some shading and intimation of folds in the cloth onto the flag. So what I'm going to do is fold it sympathetically to that. So you can fold the flag like this, vertically, along this sort of fashion. What I prefer to do is do it diagonally. You can do it left to right diagonal, so this way, or we can do it right to left diagonal. In this case, I'm going to go sympathetic to the way the artwork has been set out on the flag. Now, before this dries too rigidly, I'd suggest doing this relatively early on. In terms of getting the folds themselves, I would suggest that it's helpful to use something like a thin pencil perhaps, or, as I'm going to use maybe, one of the spare flagpoles, because we want something to fold it round and against. I will say that the thicker you go on the item you're using, say it was this craft knife, obviously the larger folds you're going to go and get, and this, in this case, would be impractical. But if you go too narrow, you might find you do very, very narrow folds. So all we're going to do is place this in the direction we want the fold to go. So as you can see, I'm going to go diagonally like that. You don't need to put too many folds in either, but it's up to you what you want to achieve in terms of that look. And then just gently roll it round. To try and get a diagonal fold. It probably won't work now, won't it? And you can see, because it's still relatively damp and it's still drying, it is quite malleable. So that's one fold that way, and then what we want to achieve is folding it back the other way. Now again, I'm sort of doing it with my fingers here, but it is useful to have something like that to help bend it back the other way. So you sort of get the idea. I'll go ahead and continue that process, and then we'll come back. So here we are, we're back with the flag that I have manipulated and folded in a variety of ways, and you can see it's curved back on itself in a variety of places. That's it from the top down. And I've tried to give it a sense of a bit more hang and a bit more weight, and at the very end flicked the corners round in counter directions, so it looks about right. What I will say is this will spring back a little bit out of the shape that you've attempted to fold it into. So what I tend to do is leave them to dry for a little bit longer after I've done this step. So just make sure it's up against something that it can't necessarily move away from. And for example, that might be this, because it's heavy enough. And we just place it so that, not that way around. And you want to place it so essentially the folds are up against it, and you just give it a little bit of compression so it's not going to move away, and then place something else on the other side and it'll just keep it in that position so it'll set. Even when you remove it, it might spring back slightly, but it just helps it keep it in a nice sort of tight set of folds if you're happy with what you've achieved. The only other tip I'll give you at this stage is that I've just gone ahead and done a series of generic folds as I like the look of. What I do when it's a unit that's ranked up as opposed to a bit more of a diorama base like this one is make sure I consider the figures around the person with the flag and the attitude in which the flag's going to be held. Now this one is on a relatively open base and standing straight up. So when I pop it into his hand, it's going to look something like that. I have, when cutting this, left it a little bit longer so that I can, if I want to, cut the flagpole down a little bit. But yeah, the way the flag will be seated, it may obscure things, it may get in the way of the placement of other figures on the base. I mean, in some I've got, they're holding them pointed to the front, not a problem. One I had on the Milan Guard Battalion, he was holding it over his shoulder to the rear, and so that's worth considering. And sometimes you can get a little bit of manipulation out of the arms of the figures themselves. But in this case, I'm relatively happy with this one, considering it's going to go onto the base with a bit more room. So for example, it might end up looking something like that. Or we could have it the other way around. But that, essentially, is the quick guide to how I do flags. The last thing I would probably do is, well, I say probably do, I'd recommend that you do is to paint the edges in, and this can be a bit more faffy on flags where there are more colours or stripes reaching the edges of different types. But in this case, a straightforward dark blue, and a red edging, just to give it that final little sort of nice, neat touch. But it's not obligatory. It sort of helps to sort of make the flag seem a bit more real, inverted commas. But it's each to their own. If you're happy with this stage, and I think I probably would be, then you could leave it like that. So the only thing remaining to do here is just to trim off that little bit of white overlap, and then paint the edges in, and then that would be ready to go. Although normally this banner pole I would have probably painted and matte varnished in already, so that I'm not worrying about overlapping paint onto the nice design. So that, in a short version, is how I go about doing flags. So just as a quick recap, cut out your flag, whatever it might be, with a sharp implement, craft knife or a pair of sharp scissors. Get your banner pole, judge it based on the figure of where you want it to sit and how you want it to sit, and how big the flag is. So for example, these British flags are much larger and you're going to need to leave a lot more room relative to the figure. So make sure you check that beforehand, because you can't really go back once you've cut the pole. Cut the pole to size, maybe give yourself a tiny little bit of extra room so that you can shorten it. You can always make the pole shorter, but you can't make it longer, obviously. Then once you've done that, get the flag itself, just give it a gentle bend around the pole, so that you can see how the sides are gonna line up. Wet the inside, or damp the inside down if you want. Alternatively, just water the PVA glue down, but not too much, because again you might saturate the design. Then bend it around the flagpole really carefully at this side, so it meets nice and tightly. Pinch it together on the opposite side, so along here. And then just carefully make sure that it lines up and meets top and bottom as you work from the flagpole to the outside edge. Then once you've done that, just check that it's all nicely lined up. You could trim any excess off that you can see at that stage, and you don't have to, you can still do it at the end. And then go ahead and apply any folds if you want to. And I recommend using some kind of guide that you can lay against it to sort of curve the flag gently around. Absolutely take your time, particularly if you're working with something that is particularly nice and you've spent a little bit of money on, like these GMB flags. And yeah, just work the folds into your desire. They could be vertical folds across if you like, diagonal folds to make it seem like it's hanging a certain way or blowing in a certain wind direction. It's entirely up to you and your own imagination. Just have at it and just take your time, because there's no particular rush apart from the fact that the glue is drying. So there is a time limit, but there isn't a rush. And then once you've got the folds in as you desire, if you're happy for it to spring back into shape a little bit, just leave it to dry in some fashion, either upright or lying down, or otherwise just have it against something so that it won't push the folds out. Although remember, if you put it against something weighted at one edge, it will push away from it, so it has to be weighted at both sides. And then once it's dry, you can go ahead, trim off any excess if you haven't already, and then paint in the edges if you want, but otherwise it'll be ready to apply to your figure. And that's probably not going to stand up. It did stand up. There you go. And so that is how we go about flags. I hope you found this somewhat useful. If I've used any products in this, you're not obliged to use those products. And frankly, with the disclaimer on this process is, your experience may differ. I did not get it wholly right the first time, and I have improved with practice. But yeah, just be cautious and enjoy. Until the next time, happy hobbying.